What is going on, everybody? What is going on? The Catch fam, my name is John Dawson, and in today's video, we will be breaking down our Week 17 waiver wire must-adds for the 2022 fantasy football season. If you guys do enjoy today's content, be sure to hit that like button on the way in. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out when you guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Without further ado, let's hop into today's video. All right, first on the list, we've got Tyler Allgeier of the Atlanta Falcons, a player we talked about last week going in to Week 16 when his overall roster percentage was a little bit lower. A couple of the players we'll be talking about today will have a higher roster percentage, essentially because we are in the final week of fantasy football for most fantasy managers, and there's just not a lot of options out there. Allgeier has 15 or more fantasy points in his last two games against two pretty decent run defenses in the Saints and the Ravens. 15.7 fantasy points in Week 16, 74 yards on the ground, and 4 receptions for 43 receiving yards. A nice outing for Allgeier. And in Week 17, he gets a Cardinals defense that just does not look existent at the moment, that just got torched by Leonard Fournette and Rachaad White in Week 16. So Allgeier, a player I loved coming into the season, I loved after he got drafted, has had some ups and downs, some really positive moments in the season, but ultimately just due to the way that this backfield for the Falcons is utilized, a lot of down points in this season as well. But here at the very end of the fantasy season, looks like he is getting a lot of production, at least 17 touches on the ground in his last two games. I think he's a great flex play, or if you're desperate at the running back position, a really solid play against the Arizona Cardinals in Week 17. Not very pretty at the running back position, so we've got Chuba Hubbard up next, coming in at 66% rostered overall according to the Sleeper app. 12.5 fantasy points in Week 16 against the Detroit Lions. Onto Foreman and Chuba Hubbard just absolutely shredded the Detroit Lions defense, a defense that had been playing pretty well against the run. 125 yards on the ground for Chuba. It's a little bit of a tougher matchup in Week 17 for the Panthers, but with the Panthers' playoff hopes and dreams technically still alive, and the fact that both Hubbard and Foreman had double digits against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Week 7, as well as the fact that James Conner looked very good for a Cardinals offense that was being, ran by a third-string quarterback last week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So even though the Buccaneers defense has played well against the run throughout the season, last week they didn't look so great. And like I said, in Week 7, they didn't look very good against Chuba and Foreman. So if you're desperate for a running back, Chuba Hubbard of the Carolina Panthers is worth a look if he is available in your respective fantasy league. All right, next up, we've got Jahan Dotson sitting at 67% rostered, a player that needs to be rostered in more fantasy leagues as we wrap up the fantasy season. Whether it's Taylor Heineke at the quarterback position or Carson Wentz going into Week 17, Dotson holds a ton of value. 16 or more fantasy points in his last 3 starts, 19.6 fantasy points against the San Francisco 49ers in Week 16, 6 receptions for 76 receiving yards and a touchdown. He has a touchdown in his last 3 games. Point blank, simple as can be in Week 17 against the Browns, or in Week 18 if you do play through Week 18 against the Dallas Cowboys. Jahan Dotson is a very nice upside flex play, a player that needs to be rostered in more fantasy leagues as we approach the end of the season. Last week we talked about the Giants wide receivers. I really said, look at who's available. Is Richie James available? Is Hodgins available? Is Slayton available? Doesn't really matter. They're playing the Minnesota Vikings, a team that essentially has no secondary. All these guys are worth a look. Go see who's available in your league. Richie James comes in as 37% rostered. He had 17 fantasy points in Week 16 against the Minnesota Vikings. He's hit double-digit fantasy points in all but 2 games since Week 11 of the fantasy season. He's been very productive. He had the most overall targets of any of the Giants receivers last week. So I don't want to say he's their primary receiver. They're definitely utilizing all 3 of their receivers in Hodgins, Slayton, and Richie James. But Richie James, who gets the Colts in Week 17, a unit that's played pretty good against the wide receiver position on the season, is still going to be worth a look as the Giants continue to keep their playoff hopes and dreams alive approaching Week 17. And that brings us to Isaiah Hodgins of the Giants. When you look at what Hodgins has done, he had 11 targets last week, right behind Richie James with 12 targets. He has a touchdown in 3 of his last 4 games. He has hit double digits in 3 of his last 4 fantasy matchups. Once again, the Indianapolis Colts, who we get in week 17, have played well against the wide receiver position, but the Giants are fighting for the playoffs. We are looking for these teams, where matchups can go out the window because these teams are giving it everything they have here at the end of the season. And really, regardless, Hodgson's production in the last couple of weeks, warrants him being picked up in fantasy leagues, right? Darius Slayton, I want to mention as well, comes in at 63% rostered, 11.9 fantasy points for him in week 16 against the Vikings. Just go look. Are the Giants receivers available in your respective leagues? Because let's face it, they are showing us enough production where they need to be rostered here at the end of the 2022 fantasy football season. All right, we got an interesting player to talk about. That's Trenton Irwin of the Cincinnati Bengals, sitting at 0% rostered according to the Sleeper app. He has hit double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 6 matchups. But what we really want to talk about here is this is a cautionary selection. This is a deep league full PPR selection. This is a boom or bust flex option for you guys. But Irwin has really carved out a role within the Bengals offense. If you guys have been watching the Bengals as of late, the issue is, when we look at weeks 12, 13, and 15, 2.6 or less fantasy points, weeks 11, 14, and last week in week 16, 13 or more fantasy points in all those matchups. His best performance came last week against the New England Patriots with 19.5 fantasy points, 2 touchdowns, right? So at the end of the day, like I said, a boom or bust option for those of you guys in deeper leagues. He gets the Buffalo Bills in week 17. This could be an option for you guys in a very competitive game script. Both of these offenses, 2 of the best offenses in the AFC, both of these teams fighting for the best possible playoff seeding going into the end of the season. So a cautionary pickup of Trenton Irwin, worth a look if you are desperate for a flex play at the wide receiver position. Greg Dortch has had a very up and down season. He's been very productive at times. He's barely seen the field at other times. It's been a really kind of frustrating year from a fantasy perspective for Greg Dortch. I want to also be cautionary with Greg Dortch going into the week because we had Trace McSorley at quarterback last week, and it looks like Colt McCoy is probably going to be ready for week 17. Either way, the Atlanta Falcons have played very poorly against the wide receiver position. They do have a great cornerback one in AJ Terrell, who will probably take most of the looks against DeAndre Hopkins. I'm not very big on Hollywood Brown at the moment, and I think that Greg Dortch could still play a nice role within week 17. But once again, I just don't know exactly how, it's just tough to read with the different quarterbacks filtering in and out for the Arizona Cardinals. With that being said, Greg Dortch had 22.3 fantasy points in week 16 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, 10 receptions for 98 receiving yards. He was the best fantasy performer at the wide receiver position for the Cardinals in week 16. He's worth a look. Once again, trying to give you guys some deep league options, some options for those of you guys who may be desperate for a flex play moving into the fantasy championship. All right, speaking of a team that is fighting for their playoff spot to stay where it is, let's talk about the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Let's talk about Russell Gage, who's 32% rostered. He's hit double-digit fantasy points in his last 2 weeks and had 9.2 fantasy points in week 14, including a touchdown. So it's obvious that Brady has enough chemistry with Russell Gage. He's kind of carved out the number 3 receiver position for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers behind Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. A little bit of boomer bust potential here, of course, but gets the Carolina Panthers in week 17. If you play through week 18, he gets the Atlanta Falcons. Favorable enough matchups, especially for a wide receiver 3, that he is worth a look in full PPR leagues if you're desperate for a wide receiver to play in week 17. All right, I had to throw a tight end on here. I know we had the Lions tight end, I don't remember his name, like their 3rd string tight end, go off out of nowhere, but I don't want to read too much into that. Just one single game. I don't want to read too much into one single fantasy performance, but let's talk about Taysom Hill, who's 63% roster, 11.6 fantasy points in week 16. Taysom Hill is your tight end 3 in standard scoring formats and your tight end 8 in full PPR. The tight end position has been such an absolute disaster this year. Got a top 8 tight end coming in at 63% rostered. I just think he needs to be rostered in more leagues. Obviously, he got a little bit more work last week as a gadget player in the awful conditions against the Cleveland Browns, but at the end of the day, I do think that Taysom Hill, who gets the Philadelphia Eagles in Week 17 and the Carolina Panthers in Week 18, if you play through Week 18, as the Saints try to kind of get as much momentum and fight for a very slim playoff chance here at the end of the season. We've got two competitive enough matchups where the opposing teams are also fighting for particular playoff circumstances that I do think Taysom Hill is a player we need to take a stronger look at. I'd like to see his overall roster percentage kind of increase after this week because the tight end position's been such a headache. At least Taysom Hill gives you a chance on a week-to-week basis and a chance in the fantasy championship. All right, I want to give you guys a couple of streaming options at the quarterback position as we do on a weekly basis. Jared Goff, a player we talked about last week as a streaming option, had 25.7 points against the Carolina Panthers, 355 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Obviously not a good day for the Lions. A game where they were playing from behind really benefited Jared Goff. He gets the Chicago Bears here in Week 17. Should be a competitive matchup against two teams within the same division, kind of struggling. And with the Lions still having their playoff hopes alive, this will be a competitive game from the Lions' perspective. Jared Goff about as good as a potential streamer that you're going to get coming in as your quarterback 9 overall on the fantasy season so far. Gardner Minshew, what a start he was in Week 16 against the Dallas Cowboys. 24.7 fantasy points, 24 completions off of 40 passing attempts, 355 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. He did have 2 interceptions and a rushing touchdown as well. This is a game in Week 17 that if the Eagles win, they secure the #1 overall seed for the playoff picture in the NFC, right? So Gardner Minshew worth a look, but keep an eye on Jalen Hurts if his status is cleared, if he's good to go in Week 17. Obviously, we're not going to have Minshew as a streaming option, but I think there's a very, very strong chance that Jalen Hurts is going to sit in Week 17 and Minshew is going to be a play once again. Brock Purdy continues to be a low ceiling quarterback play, quarterback stream. For those of you guys struggling at the position, 16.9 fantasy points against the Washington Commanders in Week 16, 234 passing yards, 2 touchdowns. He gets the Raiders in Week 17. A little bit of a better overall matchup from a fantasy perspective. Once again, you've got two teams, the San Francisco 49ers fighting for the best playoff seeding possible, then the Raiders fighting for a playoff dream at the end of the day. So Brock Purdy still an option, a pretty good game script overall. Mac Jones will get the Miami Dolphins. I know Mac Jones doesn't sound like a good fantasy stream, but if you're absolutely desperate, you can go for Mac Jones because the Dolphins are giving up a lot of fantasy points to the quarterback position. They rank in the bottom 5 against the quarterback position from a fantasy perspective. 17.5 fantasy points for Jones in Week 16 against the Bengals. 240 passing yards, 2 scores. A decent day for Mac Jones in comparison to the last couple of weeks. So Mac Jones, a desperate streaming option. I think there are probably better quarterbacks available. Danny Dimes comes in as your quarterback 10 so far on the season. We talked about him last week as a streaming option. He's 68% rostered. May not be available for you guys, but he's coming off of a 21.7 fantasy performance against the Minnesota Vikings. 334 passing yards, a touchdown, a pick, 34 yards on the ground. He gets the Colts. This is a game that the Giants are going to do whatever they can to win as they continue to keep their playoff push alive. Danny Dimes worth a look as always as a streaming option at the quarterback position moving into the fantasy championship. And that'll do it for today's video. If you guys did enjoy the content today or find it helpful, be sure to hit that like button on the way out. Hit that subscribe button, of course, if you're new to the channel. It really does help us out. You guys hit that like and consider subscribing. And please feel free to drop any comments, questions, concerns pertaining to the 2022 fantasy football season down below. I'll get back to you guys as soon as I possibly can. With that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.